and non-separation. So it was quite beautiful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Hi, Jyothy, meet Sheeba, meet Qusai, meet
Hello,
Badri.
hello.
Hi, Jyothy.
Qusai and I have actually met like nearly a decade ago, I think now. Yeah. Yeah, another universe. Nice to see you, Jyothy. I must confess, I'm very jealous of Qusai's background of the bookshelf. You know, it's like the swankiest Zoom.
That's my daughter in the background. I try to find like one corner of the house where they wouldn't keep coming in. But
I mean, it's in a time, so I can see that.
So we're now live on link, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know how it happened or what exactly happened there. That was very, very interesting. I will just forward this new link to our team so that we can pass it on to others who want to watch it as well, whoever's in the old video. Okay, so guys, welcome. Thank you for bearing with us through that very, very interesting disruption of flow. Because if anything else, I feel like it behooves us to sort of figure out how to reorient ourselves and reorganize ourselves where we were. And essentially, I was just about to say, okay, let's just say one or two things about this effort, and then we can get into that conversation because we would have done it by now. So essentially, lawyers, artists, and others talk law, love, and equity. Is meant to be an exercise into sort of exploring truth and beauty and wisdom with some amount of perspective. So the idea here is to have a slow kind of conversation, the kind of conversation that you could have while you're trying to make a connection with yourself. Qusai ended his meditation with this aspiration for the eyes to behave like the ears, in a non-judgmental way, and to receive whatever wisdom is around us. That's precisely the aspiration of this series. We've had very interesting speakers. We've had judges from the Supreme Court. We've had lawyers. We had a Raga exploration session last time around. We had some leaders from the Aam Aadmi Party talking about why they do what they do. And so that's what we're trying to explore here. Now, in the second part of our conversation, we are exploring the environmental journeys of three of our panelists and another interlocutor. So we have Abhayraj and Sheeba and Jyothy. You all know a little bit about their background. Qusai, of course, is here as well. But we're going to come back to that in their own language, as opposed to introducing them as is expected of exercises of this sort. This series is also meant to be a fundraiser for the fallout of COVID. We are trying to raise some money so that there can be social security for migrant workers, so that there can be food security for the urban poor and protective gear for caregivers. Right? These are three most important priorities of the human aspects of COVID. We're also trying to raise some money for the relief efforts in the Sundarbans as well. There are some of these links are going to be circulated in the live chat. Please look them up. We've been urging people to subscribe to our YouTube channel and donate about as little as what you might spend on one meal while ordering on Zomato or Swiggy or any other platform, right? It's small acts of kindness done repeatedly which are far more useful than large, grand actions of kindness, right? So we're talking about building habits which are oriented towards seeing another's existence. So anyway, so coming back to today's session, we're going to explore some environmental journeys. And let me just kick off with the first question that sort of, that's been playing in my mind, I suppose, all of today, and particularly so after Qusai's point, which is that the relationship with ourselves and with nature, the language of that seems to be far more sensual and driven by the sensations and the senses than the language of law and the state and all of these other structures of authority. And the question that I want to begin with is that all of us here and all of you here specifically straddle that boundary very, very often. You have to think about governance, you need to think about policy, but at the same time, you're thinking about your deep relationship with nature and how it organizes itself. So, Abhay, you want to say one or two things about the language, the sensuality of the language of your experience with nature? How did you get into it, and what is your understanding of that relationship?
Sure. Thanks, Badri. Thanks for having us here. It's an awesome venture, and I'm quite looking forward to being moved in different ways through this conversation. I think you've started off with a difficult question for me to effectively articulate a response to, mostly because my body and mind are still quite actively trying to make sense of where I am on this question.
Mm.
My own sense is there is always something that can emerge, however closed or fixed or framed a structure might be, or a context might be, or a situation might be. So I'm sort of a believer in magic, if you wish. There is a rabbit that can be pulled out of that magician's hat if things work in a particular way. And in that sense, I think that the language of law, the language of the state, even reason have that possibility of emergence, which I really heard in Qusai's words some time back. I mean, I'll use a different phrase to articulate it. Some kind of sensuous immediacy with nature, where you're not grasping, you're not labeling, even time no longer corresponds to the tick, tick, tick on a clock or a watch.
Mm.
And one can create those possibilities wherever you might be. Or I think even the most closely defined and structured space will have those seeds of possibilities. So for me, it has been and it continues to be a really long journey of rewiring myself. I think from a very young age, uh, I was advised and taught and signaled to that being structured, having a clear expression, connecting things to concepts is the way to go. And only somewhere along life's journey, this new way of being sort of presented itself to me as something that I could aspire to be in totality, right? So I'm still very much a work in progress, rewiring, allowing mm, uh, purer and more direct ways of relating to others, and of also seeing my own embeddedness in a very, very related world to flow into everything I do.
Mm. Mm. That's a beautiful answer, Abhay. I mean, I don't want to reflect on it just yet because I'd much rather hear what Jyothy and Sheeba have to say. Jyothy, would you like to go next? Because I noticed this again, this kind of conflict again in the pieces that you've written, right? Because there's almost a like, you know, it's like we often celebrate nature almost in this nostalgic, I mean, like happy but sad kind of way. And I wonder what you make of that. Like, how do you relate joyously and at the same time have the courage to see what we need to do next and where we go here in terms of governing ourselves?
Okay, so I grew up I spent most of my childhood summer vacations in the Nilgiri biosphere. My mother's family was there. So I was a child with a very active imagination, and I grew up with Amar Chitragatha and Enid Blyton and all that, Enchanted Woods and all that, right? So I used to take these walks into the forest, you know, like with the and when the rain is pouring down, and the tribes that used to live around the farm, they believe that the forests were a spirit in itself, right? So there are these gods that they would have, and it was just there was a sort of like reverence that you felt for the forest, you know. It's not that some adults told me to be scared or respectful of the forest or anything. And at the same time, there was this sort of unwritten rule that you don't hurt anything, you know, in those spaces. I mean, even otherwise, but particularly in those spaces, not even an insect, you know. So even if a leech bites you, which happens quite often, you just put salt on top of it, and that is my connection with nature. And that's and in that growing, you never thought of yourself as separate from nature.
Mm.
So when I grew up and started doing these stories related to environment, and I was introduced to this community of conservationists and wildlife, whatever, all those, I kind of felt that there was this sort of disconnect because everybody seemed to talk about nature as the other, and that was so weird to me because that was not my experience, and I think that's also what draws me to working with indigenous community, because I feel like I can relate more to them than to the communities living in urban spaces, uh, because their approach is as if they were the other, um, so that's the same thing for me with like conflict and things. It's um, I don't know how you can kind of draw this clear line and say, this is where the forest ends and this is where humanity begins. We are all like, intermingled. So I don't know if I answered your question, but yeah, this was
I
my
think because
experience.
it's so much of it has to do with how you encounter this for the first time, right? And it
Yeah.
reminds me of what Qusai said right at the start of his session. He, after the first exercise, he said something about breath that you breathe circulating through all of the world in a span of a year or some time period. But the idea that the same oxygen molecules that are feeding me are feeding you and feeding the next thing, and we grow together out of that, for at least with carbon-based life forms. I find it pretty fascinating. But Jyothy, the idea that what you're speaking of right now is sparking off in me is a question I've been mulling over a lot in the recent past, which is what does it mean for us to be indigenous to our time right now? So how can we relate to an urban setting the way someone relates to, a forest community relates to its forest, right? To its jungle. A place of chaos and possibility and randomness and beauty and all of those things. And Abhay and I have been talking for a while about whether we can have more urban biodiversity, instead of the stale, manicured kind of gardens. But we'll definitely flag this and come back to this point. That when you say you're connected to these people, let's explore why and what is it about this kind of connection. What is it about being indigenous that has so much to do with this sensuality of it? The sensation of being connected to what is around you. Sheeba, would you like to go next on this too heavy, too soon question?
I mean, I'm trying to grasp, Padri. You were talking about the language of environment, of nature, and
your language of encountering nature. Because I think Abhay hinted at that, and even for me, my encounter with nature was not primal. It came through the Environment Protection Act, for instance. We also had a trek and a bunch of other things when we studied law, but that happened before I learned to appreciate the sensuality and the magic, as Abhay is speaking about, in nature, to allow for the possibility of the earth turning into lava below our feet right now. If you can imagine it, there's a possibility. We just don't know the kind of circumstances that have to come together for that possibility to manifest. And that just so happens to be what Abhay might have referred to as magic. But I'm asking you about the way you happen to encounter nature. What was the language of that encounter for you?
Yes, I mean, like there are 2-3 words that sort of come to me right now in response to this question. One was co-evolution.
Mm-hmm.
I sort of said it's co-evolving. How do I co-evolve with what's around me? Number 2, I thought of co-creation. I sort of whatever I'm creating, how do I co-create it with what's around me? Mm-hmm. And thirdly, I think I've been a seeker of beauty, which is like the widest thing possible. So for me, I always thought of beauty, and whenever I talk about what's around me, and this was also the time when I was up to 7 years housed and working with the mountain communities. So I was not necessarily in an urban environment. So I thought of beauty. So these were the 3 sorts of anchors for me in starting to develop my, I guess, language and my relationship with my environment. But for me, Badri, people were very much part of this co-evolution, because I believe that the only way I can really experience whatever I'm doing is through a human lens, because I'm human. I am nothing else. So I took a lot of solace in connecting with other people in this co-evolution. And initially, when I started off, it was sort of in my kind of mid-20s. Like with any kind of journey, I went through a stage of rebellion where I found urban settings to be violating me in many ways, even though I've been a city girl and I love cities. And, I feel cities are such hot spots of co-evolution, of beauty, of co-creation. But I think gradually over time, when I sort of went inwards, I found that for me, this dichotomy started to dissolve. I felt I could relate and co-create and co-evolve myself in any scenario. And that journey and that energy, I think I sort of try to channelize through something that's very actionable. Action is like so important to whatever I craft. And that's what my work is about. And I don't see a separation in my work and my life otherwise. For me, it's one ecosystem.
That's a great answer, because what's interesting across the four of you is that we are at once talking about the act of separation and recognizing your humanity, and at the same time you're recognizing your oneness with humanity as a continuum with nature. I do feel like seeing yourself and seeing the other and seeing the self and the other as a continuum is an essential part. So there is, all three of them seem to have to take place for that to happen. Qusai, do you want to reflect on that before we move into our next round of questions?
Sure. I had a couple of thoughts which were provoked by what you guys have said. I'm just, for me personally, also I grew up in Bombay, and I was quite a city. Kids are shouting in the background. Sorry. Can you keep quiet, please? So and I was quite of an urban kid. Like I was not that exposed to nature, and I ended up moving to the States, and I started like hiking and started I think looking at nature as it's kind of something beautiful. So there was a beauty aspect, like, oh, it's so beautiful. These mountains are so beautiful. These trees are so beautiful. I felt that there was still a bit of a kind of I suppose objectification in kind of it's like you're looking at something and calling it beautiful. It's still a little separate from you. I lived in Oregon for a few years, and I used to go into the forest hunting for mushrooms, the edible mushrooms, chanterelles and morels, not the other kind. But so we were, and that we had to kind of bushwhack through the forest to look for these like flushes of chanterelles which come up, or these lone morels or pine mushrooms, which are much harder to find. And that gave me a different gaze, where then I was inhabiting the kind of forest not as a tourist in that gaze, but as someone who's looking at it for food, right? At that time, and you're out and you're looking for food, and if you're doing it a few times, so that was I felt like that was a kind of a new relationship, and with nature, and it's evolved since then in kind of the spiritual way of looking at the forest, as Jyothy was saying, as a spirit, as a being, and and the whole earth as a being, and things like that coming out of it. And in terms of the city, you also raised this point about the city being, how do we look at the city? I think when one of my friends was talking about that, like the city in terms of social relationships is like the Amazon forest, right? It's very like there's so many people behind every window, every building with all these windows. There's a person with all these stories and these many people. So we're in this very diverse place of humans. We have a very, a big human ecology and a lot of political ecology. I've been reading this Frenchman named André Gorz. I think he wrote this book called Ecologica, and lots of essays and stuff like that. And he was influenced by the existentialists, but he eventually became a kind of ecologist or political ecologist, talking about keeping that diversity alive, essentially, as we're living in these kind of structures which become where we are living in this kind of where we are not so much individuals, but we play these roles as if part of this big machine, which is part of production and consumption and capitalism and all that stuff. we don't really show ourselves. We kind of show what we're supposed to be, or this role. And so then we are kind of otherifying ourselves, and we are engaging in this sphere where it's all others. We are an other within others. I don't know if that's clear or not.
Yeah.
But to find that diversity, so like to actually celebrate our uniqueness, celebrate our humanity and our individualism, because we were born as our own, subjects, each unique and indivisible kind of thing, which I think is a part of what you learn from nature, and this kind of. So how do we live in this kind of way, right? And when we started gather, that's kind of part of the ethos of it.
Hey, that is such a that was interesting to me, because you framed it in the context of the roles that we sort of adopt, which was similar to what Jyothy and Sheeba said earlier as well, right? And I think that has so much to do with the roles that we sort of cast ourselves in, and often recognizing the richness of the human experience, which is again harkening back to what Sheeba was talking about earlier. So my next question for you, it is slightly lighter, is let's do a quick round of introductions, but the way we're going to do introductions is slightly different. So tell us a bit about yourself without talking about what you do or where you're from, right? So let's see if we get to understand a little more about the richness of your life outside of your work and your history, so to say. What does your soul look like? And describe it if you can. So Abhay, we have to start with you.
Sure, start with me on what my soul looks like. So the lawyer in me has raised to the fore at so many levels to this question. Do I even have a life without what I do or where I'm from is right on top of that list. But let me play by the rules and try and take that question on its terms. I think I am someone who is constantly reconstituting myself, if that makes sense. I am, I don't know if I am one, and philosophically, I am a little confused on whether there is one unified self. And the more I go out into the world, the more I understand that what I thought of as me is lots of moments, and mm, uh, the actual I, the soul, if you wish, is mostly not doing anything, just observing and witnessing. So for me, an unfinished journey, as I said, is always bringing that harmony in what I do in this form, or with these words, in this context, in sort of congruence with the that witness in me that I perceive dimly sometimes, more intensely at other times. And strangely enough, there is no time that's working in this space. It's just a series of things that it's not, series is the wrong word. It's just happenings that could be arranged forward to backward or backward to forward. So your question has forced me to get into really, really cookie language, but I'm doing the best I can in trying to respond to it on its terms. So I think I am life that's trying to both do and be in more symmetry and harmony.
Hey, that's a great answer, Abhay, because essentially you're casting yourself as the witness as opposed to anything else. You don't seem to want to disturb the world around you, but just observe what it does to the body that you happen to inhabit and see what you happen to see, which for me is interesting, because essentially you're saying that your aspiration is really to broaden your perception and maybe learn one or two things along the way. You're not really saying anything more about I mean, I thought you can talk about what you do in your free time. Abhay. You could have spoken about your hobbies, That
what free time? What is this free time that you refer to?
It's a mythical creature. It doesn't exist in our world. Okay, but that was a beautiful answer, man. I expected no less from you. Jyothy, do you want to take a shot at that question of how would you describe yourself without talking about what you do or where you're from?
Okay, so I will take the easy route and tell you what I do in my free time. So I would call myself a gardener, an artist, film fan. Um, yeah, that's about it. Like, it's pretty simple.
No, see, we've gone from reading philosophy and Sartre and like Buddhism to classifieds in Hindu, So I don't think this is a fair representation of you at all, Jyothy. You're not going to escape with this. We're going to come back to you for more stories very, very soon. I mean, like, because I'm looking at you and I'm like, here's a superwoman. This is not superwoman, to be very specific, a Wonder Woman, like, who's had many ways of engaging with nature and seems to be competent in ways that I can't even imagine with my own life. So anyway, so we're not even going to get into that for now. We'll come back to it in a little bit. Sheeba, how do you want to talk about yourself if you don't talk about what you do or where you're from?
I think I have the benefit of time. It's always, I love going last, always. So I've jotted some stuff out that just came to me in the past 2 minutes. I think I think in the spirit of absolute honesty, I'll just read it out. I think of the word vulnerable. I think my soul is quite vulnerable, and I embrace that. I'm seeking beauty. I'm seeking love. I'm seeking a sort of weightlessness, sort of a oneness with my own essence. So I want to experience weightlessness, like air. I'm very inspired by water. So I want to experience like flow, like you're constantly flowing. I really want to do that. And I'm a tree girl, like trees are like my absolute fantasy. So I want to feel like does it really mean to be rooted? Like what does it really mean to go deep and so high, and to nourish? And I think I also, my soul is sort of seeking a vastness of sorts. I want to experience vastness. So I don't know. I mean, I'm going on the theme of introduction of the soul. So I think that's what my soul is thinking, is possibly about. I don't know. Yeah.
That's a wonderful answer as well. I mean, I share a similar aspiration for balance and rootedness and also weightlessness simultaneously. It seems like such a contradiction, right? It shouldn't be possible, but I do feel we do have spiritual connections in the sense of how we talk about different spirits like earth and water and fire and wind, and we can sort of tap into our elementality the way we want to, to be able to intersect with our surroundings, so to say. Qusai, I want to say one or two things about this, and before we move on.
I'm kind of a explorer of many things. I'm kind of I particularly like music and movement stuff, as well as philosophy. And I think I'm a person who seeks to make connections between things. I feel that the essence of things lies kind of in between things, and there's so much to be learned from everything. In a way, so you have this kind of broadness of, I seek this broadness of knowledge, but I think it's eventually to understanding the kind of common thread of things. I think as I've practiced this in my life in different ways and learning different things, I'm a lover of learning. That's been the kind of fruit of this journey, is to kind of see how everything is the same in a way. It's all different but the same, and that kind of interplay between unity and diversity, or that kind of idea. I don't know if that's enough, but
that's a great answer, Qusai, for a bunch of reasons. I feel like I know you for such a long period now, and like practically family, I would say, in more ways than one. It sounds horrible for other reasons, but anyway, like what I took from that was obviously your deep love for learning and your love for connections. You don't really give two hoots about whether two disciplines have to intermingle with each other. And when I think about you, I often think about the vastness of your experience of the world, and your willingness to take what you want, in a way sometimes that ignores the context of that thing, sometimes to your detriment and sometimes to your benefit. But it's a cool attitude to sort of have to life, where you can borrow from anywhere and then see what comes out of it. That's interesting. So okay, so this was an interesting like spiritual grounding for where we're coming from. And then the question that I have for all of you, and starting with Abhay, is, see, like all of you seem to love nature very deeply. So do I. And I've had my own interactions with this as well. And the question that I want to ask all of you is, at what point of time did you stop just being someone who appreciates nature to being someone who felt the need to take up the cause of nature, act on behalf of nature? Can you speak of the experience or the thing that shifted in your mind from an imagination for how you should, what you should do henceforth, from just appreciating it and being one with it and experiencing it as you have until then? I wonder if my question is clear enough, but Abhay, I hope you can say something about that. When did you become an activist? What was it? What experience led to you becoming an activist?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, the question is clear, and I have to admit that this conversation is so awesome because it's making me answer things that I have just sort of buried or ignored for the longest time. So here's the story. I think I became an activist when I was a law student close to 16, 17 years back. And I became an activist because that was the cool thing to do while you were in law school. And I was an activist in the human rights space, the social justice space, and this took me to the environment space. But then and for many, many years after, I was an environmental activist because it was in my head a, a cool thing to do, and it sounded so beautiful when I articulated my reasons for being an environmental activist. So basically, I was a bit of a charlatan through that process. I was interested, and at one level, I was committed, but the connection with the environment and nature that I now hold was not there at all. And I found it to be sufficiently complex for my mind to be interested in it. I didn't get bored of it. It wasn't an easy problem to solve. It took me to cool places. I have liked biology always as a student, so I learned more and more about the beauty of life. But I think it was only in and through some very transformative moments in my life that didn't come from the environmental space. These are personal things that really sort of stopped me where I was and forced me to relook at myself. That, in light of the fact that I was already in the environmental space and thinking and talking environment, allowed me to sort of cross a bridge and really connect with nature. Because these moments in life, some of them were traumatic, some of them were epiphanies, but all of them forced me to look inwards. And then I really began to sort of be brutally honest with myself. You're bullshitting here. You're just doing this because you want someone to like you. You're just doing this because you're actually insecure and afraid. And this process continues to this day. But as I was doing this stuff and getting really comfortable, and again, I'm reminded of something Qusai said, as I got to know myself better, I also began to really see a lot more of the world around me. And once I could see a lot more of the world around me, I quite naturally fell in love with it. It was so beautiful. It had so much possibility. So I think that's how it evolved. And the sort of, if I may call it, the purer environmental activism that actually comes from a very, very good space is of relatively recent origins. I would just sort of trace it back to maybe 9 years or 8 years, whereas my original work in the environmental space began almost 15 or 16 years back.
Oh, that's fascinating. I think, Abhay, you and I have had the privilege of pretense, like in a certain way, we've been in contexts which have allowed us to take up causes without fully understanding the motivations behind it. And I call it a privilege because, when it's a safe kind of environment where you get to engage with the theory of it, as opposed to the experience of it, the sensuality of it, where we began this conversation, it does come in the way of experiencing the sensuality. And but it seems like if you're doing environmental work, it's almost impossible to ignore the sensuality. So I mean, kudos to you to come back to yourself and thereby find a way to come to nature. Thanks for that answer. Jyothy, do you want to talk about like a key experience? I mean, like if you can tell a story, that will be nice. A key experience or that you had in your life where all of a sudden you realized, you know what, I mean, I have to participate here. And it's not just a matter of me documenting art for my own sake, but the function of my art is to be able to design a better kind of life and a better kind of relationship between humans and the ecosystems that they occupy. Can you speak to that, please?
So, so for the most part of my adult life, I worked as a photojournalist and a travel photographer. So I would work for newspapers, travel magazines, business magazines, etc. It was very thrilling. Yeah, you get to travel to all kinds of countries and have all kinds of experiences which very few other people would have, and also showcases and everything. So I think when I think back on that period of my life, although it was it was really great, but I think it was also a period of amnesia of sorts. I kind of like completely uh, stopped thinking about who I was, what made me who I am, and all my experiences and my childhood and all sorts of things that I kind of chose to not think about. And also, I think I was also working like crazy. I would in a year, I would on average I'd do like about 200 assignments. That was like really crazy. Um, but over time, what also happens is when you're working with media, especially as a photographer, you're always kind of illustrating somebody else's story, you know. So and especially when you work with international media, um, you don't really have a voice, unless it is something that fits their agenda and their storyline and what the Western audience is ready to hear, you know. So I was really feeling that I did not have agency and voice within my work, and it was not very acceptable for me.
Mm.
It was around that time when my uncle one day, who lives in the Nilgiris, he showed me some pictures of a man who was mauled by a tiger. And he was like, see, like you are going around the world telling stories of other people. These things are happening in our village. What are you doing about it? So it wasn't accusatory or anything, but then he was just genuinely concerned. It was a real problem that they were facing, and that time the state of things were like the incidence of conflict was so high, that, and it was so regular that unless it was a man story about a man-eating tiger, it doesn't even get reported in the newspaper if somebody dies, and in retaliation, people kills the wild animals as well. So I think that really did bother me, because in a way I felt like, this was like my entire village was also like me. They did not have a voice, they didn't have an agency. Anything that was happening to them in terms of policy, in terms of what action is taken to mitigate conflict, everything happens outside of them. They're not really, there's no participation really. The MLAs come when they need votes. There are many communities that falls through the cracks. They don't have any NGOs to support them. They have nothing, and really they're not really the people who did all this destruction, So I felt there was really, like, I really felt that I need to do meaningful work, that is that I felt was urgent. At that time, I really struggled to get anybody interested, actually, because nobody really cared about human-animal conflict in some village somewhere in India, in the Nilgiri biosphere or not. But I felt, I was doing the right thing. So I mean, so in a way, like, I'm still continuing, and I think that was like the beginning. And after that, it was a constant questioning of things, everything from water to air to elephants, or it was all like connected. It kind of like happened organically. And this is why I think also that you don't need to be I don't know, especially inspired. Like, you just have to ask questions about the things around you, and you will be drawn to that line of inquiry. So yeah, so that was my experience.
That's a great answer, because the last thing that you said resonates with me as a way of being, which is that I think like curiosity and compassion is a great place to begin, and it's one way of reorganizing and reorienting yourself towards nature. But I want to pick on a particular thread of conversation. I think Sheba's answers next would really feed into that very nicely. But you might have one or two sentences to add here, Jyothy. So let me just state the question. So whether it was in the Nilgiris or with situations like the RA forest or the unpack that you're seeing right now, or even the Sundarbans and the destruction that you're seeing, it feels like our love for nature always comes out of its absence. Maybe this is a fact about love itself, which is that it's only visible when it's not abundant anymore. The question I want to ask you is, there's an experience of the magnificence of nature where the love for nature is driving your action, and you will do anything for it. It's much like other forms of love, but how do we sort of organize ourselves around acting out of the positivity and abundance of nature, as opposed to the fear of its loss? And did you have can you speak of an experience in the recent past, the last one you remember? It's not so much about which experience as much as what it was, where you experienced the abundance of nature in this most beautiful, like insanely like sublime kind of way. Sublime is beautiful because the word came from the idea of experiencing awe and fear simultaneously, right? There's this sense of largeness and vastness, and the deep sense of encountering a beauty that you will never be able to fully perceive with the senses that are available to you. The only reason I'm asking you this question is how do we think about movements where we need to act, and act with some urgency and not come across as the guys who are coming in the way of development. This is such horrible framing, because it's not like development is supposed to be anti-nature. Like a development which doesn't pay attention to nature is not development, full stop. It's not even a debate, right? But how do we organize ourselves in a context of crisis where we're responding, for one? And then two, can you speak about an experience with abundance? And then I'm very curious about Sheba's take on the same kind of theme. But Jyothy, what do you have to say about these two ideas?
I think for me, how I feel about nature and the environment and everything, it strongly is associated with childhood, really. Actually, as an adult, I have had more experiences diving with sharks, jumping off planes, all kinds of stuff, and all kinds of,
You can't
experiences.
just say that casually, like I took a walk. I
No, but
that's like, we don't say this. You could be a James Bond stunt extra the way you're speaking of it, but maybe you could say it like with a little more gravitas, because that totally deserved it. I mean, in case it wasn't obvious to you.
yes, but no, but what I'm trying to say is that magic that you experience as a child, I feel that's the strongest, and I think that is what is missing now as well. If, for even now, like, so we have been also thinking about how can we influence a policy, or like what can we do to make people care about nature, environment, and things like that, right? Perhaps we are a bit late for this now, but I think we can start somewhere, and there are people who are doing a lot of work also. But I think this childhood stories, magic, these are the things that make you care before things are lost. So for me, it was not that, like, you lost everything and then you are then I'm suddenly surprised that, like, oh, this has happened. For me, it was more like this is still happening, and I can still do something about it. And although the sense of loss is accelerated in the past years, um, but that is always there, like, so you're trying to do the best you can to, I know it goes back to the nostalgia that you were talking about, but it's such a powerful force, which I don't think adult experiences can compete with.
I'm
So
not
yeah.
going to say anything more about this because I like Qusai looks calm and collected, but his inside must be bursting right now because he's a big fan of being childlike in the present. And I think this, even what Abhay said earlier, and I sort of relate to a bit of both of that, is this return to the womb and starting over again. And like what you're saying evokes that kind of possibility. So I suppose the challenge for us is to regain our childlike experience so that we can act from a place of strength as opposed to a place of loss, and despair. So I suppose as opposed to I have to do something, it's more like I just have to do what I have to do. The next person will do what they have to do. So there's a certain matter of fact attitude to it, without the despair associated with loss. And I don't know if that's the right sort of interpretation of what you're saying, but do you think that's the general direction or import?
No, I was in. For me, it was more like I had these tools, which I thought was my superpower. My camera was my superpower, and I think that simple equipment can give a lot of agency and voice to issues that I want to give. So I it was not so much as passing the bucket, but it was more like what can I do, and what can I do to contribute, and what can I do to this thing. So but actually, like, after some years of documenting these things, I'm also trying to work with people who are taking it, who are also thinking about, okay, these are the tools to communicate, like you can communicate and create awareness, and now what can we do with it, like how can we bring about behavioral change, how can we bring about awareness. So I'm also now looking into that. Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, so it is still self-reflective. It's not so much about what tools you have to acquire, but what tools you already have, so you can.
Yeah, sure.
Nice. Okay. Sheeba, I know you have a lot to say about abundance. I'd love to hear what you have to say in the context of this answer,
I see two questions there, Badri. One was your experience of how your connection with nature translated into action. And the second is how do we come from a place of abundance as opposed to a place of loss and despair in our action. So I think the answer to the first question, in the interest of time, I'd sort of, my story is, I'm a classic middle class, born and bred second sibling from a middle class family in Lucknow, moving on to Delhi, where our parents really just sought financial security and a sort of a status in the society where our children are educated well. So it was very humble and magnolia in that sense. And I kind of grew up with those aspirations. And then I went on to study. My world opened. I met people from all over the world. I was studying in England. I'm a lawyer by training and education. So I worked as a corporate lawyer, and this is around my early 20s, where I started to get a real sense of unrest, very similar to Jyothy, where I felt, I've done what I've sort of was grown up. This was the silver bullet. I think I've cracked it, and it makes me feel nothing amazing. Like, is this it? I'm making rich people richer. We were, I was getting a lot of financial security, but it didn't make me feel good at all. So I guess my seeking, when I say I was seeking, I was like, there's surely got to be more exhilarating experiences. So I think my unrest started from there, and that was the intent that I sent out, and my life began to unravel in that sense. there's something that I want to talk about here, which I don't often mention. For me in particular, I was in England and I'm generally hot-headed and very opinionated. I felt as if I was very privileged. I was getting a great education and I had the freedom to learn. And I felt I could put it to better use. And at that point of time, I really felt I should put it to better use back in India. Because as an Indian in a sort of a very multicultural space in London, I felt my frustrations, but then I felt I could be double-sided by not really doing much about it. So I said, hey, let's jump head first. It's exhilarating. I kind of took those risks, came back home. That was the time, Qusai, I was that transitional year in Bombay. I found some amazing people. I was figuring myself out. And then my life took me to the mountains in Uttarakhand. And I think that's where I took the plunge. I said, I want to put my education to better use. So for in this country, so let's start from the grassroots. That was really all my plan. So I got myself a job with one of the most amazing organizations in the mountains. I worked there for 4 years and I learned ground up what rural ecosystems are about. I worked on health, better health possibilities for rural mothers and children, malnutrition, better quality of education, creating livelihoods. Sorry, am I still on the call?
You are.
Yeah, sorry, my screen shifted.
No,
so in all of that, I think what I learned was the micro. I learned that how a rural ecosystem, and in that sense, rural makes a point because we were surrounded by natural resources as opposed to in a city a lot more. So my journey to kind of start relating and understanding the human experience kind of deepened there. And I sort of was drawn towards the root causes of certain loss and despair in relation to nature. So while I was working on better education or better livelihoods, I felt like the way we meet our needs as human, I felt that was fundamentally flawed. And I started asking the questions that how might we meet our needs in a way that makes nature more abundant? How might we co-evolve with nature? How might we, through every action of yours, actually leave nature net more abundant? And because if it's net more abundant, we're going to be net more abundant. And then of course there are many things that came from there. So I think that was my space of asking these how might we questions. I'd learned a hell lot in those 4 years of the micro. I felt I was ready to go upstream, zoom out. I founded Alaap at that time. That was also the time that I'd bought a piece of land in the mountains after, about 3 years of working there. I felt like I wanted to have a home there. I'd become a new mother. I had my little baby, and it was all too amazing to raise a child in the midst of forests. So I did that, and the land that we got was, pretty barren. It had no forest, no trees on it. That's the only reason we could afford it. And then our next step was like, I wanted to make a forest on it because my love during those 4 years was really, I was drawn to trees, and I felt a sublimity, in my own being in that kind of a space. So when I planted a forest at the back of my home, I think for me, that was an experiential turning point in my journey to turn into action. It was completely transformative. I still recommend that to everyone, that do whatever you may, but please plant trees in your life. It'll change you. It'll change you. It'll change you at a time you may not realize now, but you'll realize at some point in time before you die. So please plant trees. So it was super, uber, ultra, almost obscenely transformational for me to create a forest in my backyard. And I think in that process, I learned that surely this transformation is not mine alone, because I feel connected to others, to humans, to the ecosystem. And this transformation is for all to be experienced. So it started pretty humbly from there, saying, hey, what if we just made forests? Any piece of land we find, let's just plant a forest there. And let's see, and if the forests are intact, if nature is abundant, it will help people to live better. And it will transform them. So I think we did that. I did that for about a year and a bit. And that's when I started learning that it's a co-evolution process. While I thought about that, how will it translate into my actions? So that's when we started to move beyond saying, hey, just planting forests is not going to do anything. These trees are going to still get cut because the root causes, the way we meet our needs right now, whether it's energy, whether it's food, whether it's water, is in a way where we are very extractive. They're not regenerative. How can we make this more regenerative? And that's what I'm doing right now. It's quite pragmatic. Yeah.
Yeah, that was such a beautiful answer. This, it still begs the question of whether the forces are oriented in the direction of regeneration, because often it feels like we're in a world where regeneration is not really in the interests of everyone who's involved, right? And I know you framed this almost towards the end to say that more abundance in nature means more abundance for us. But your entire answer was about the need for abundance in and of itself. It didn't appear as though you were really making a case for protecting nature because it's going to take care of us necessarily. And I took the spirit of that from what you were saying, as opposed to necessarily the words that we use to communicate that. I hope that's not inappropriate. Okay, so Qusai, quick reflections on that, and I think we have time for maybe 2 questions. So, but I already know what they are, so we'll just come to that in a bit. Qusai, what are your thoughts on this? What for you personally has marked the shift from being an appreciator of nature to one who acts for and with nature?
Well, I think there's elements of all these, of everyone's answers in this. And, my family had some land outside Bombay, and, we planted trees and trying to afforest that area, thinking of myself as the custodian of the land rather than the owner of the land, like not as property. And for me, it does go back to a lot of kind of theory of like, basically, I feel like all this destruction and the root cause of how we're exploiting our resources in an unsustainable way is from the feeling of alienation we feel from it, and in it, kind of the culture we live in, and capitalism to some extent, or ultra capitalism, is all about making us feel inadequate or alienated, and therefore and then looking towards stuff to kind of fill that void which is created within us. So theories from like the situationists and the society of the spectacle, we are living in the spectacle and we're buying into the spectacle, that kind of stuff. And from my own mind, so just being in nature kind of takes you away from, removes you from that spectacle and gets you into some kind of real relationship, like when you're working with land and you're working with stuff. So I feel like that's where it's from reading that kind of French theory from the late 60s to kind of seeing how that all flows, and really for me a big part of what I think about now is how we can live together in a way which is sustainable, and it's about a balance of what the realization I've come to, at least for myself, is that and looking at some of these rural places, because one of the thoughts that I thought about from a urban person who suddenly started liking and loving nature and just going for hikes and being in the forest and doing stuff, it's like, wow, this is so beautiful. Like, just be in nature and everything is good. And then, then I wonder that there's many rural communities, especially in America, where you have like white trash communities out, which live in nature. And you're like, these people have nature and they're not happy, right? They want to get drunk or take crystal meth or like move to the city. A lot of people who are living in nature want to move to the city. And that was a big question of mine. It's like, okay, they are living in an abundant nature and they want to leave it and come and maybe live in slums or some situation like that. And it's like, I can't even imagine why anyone would want to do that. And these are the questions which I'm thinking, and I think it's some combination of culture and nature, right? And how we can integrate these two, where you are connected to the land and to all the elements of nature, and still live together with humans in this way. And I think for me, that's the combination that I'm very interested in.
I think Qusai, I feel compelled to add something here, because this is, we've just done a ethnographic study of 60 farmers in Karnataka across the state. We were meant to do 100, but then the virus hit us, and we moved on the east coast from the dry lands of about 100 kilometers outside of Bangalore, in Chikbalapur, which is very dry, rocky, drought-prone. There's a lot of loss, and and forests are gone. There's no water, and all of those things. People are struggling to survive, and people are moving to the city for migrant labor. The youth are lost, the usual. And then we had gone right to the other end of the state in the abundant Ghats, in the Western Ghats, in Sirsi, and we met with 30 farmers, and what we learned there was so much abundance there in nature. Happiness, by the way, is extremely elusive. It's got nothing to do with anything. So it's very individualistic. So, and what we found there was exactly the same trend as we found in the drylands. One of the phrases, about 25 out of 30 people, farmers said, our village is like an old age home. Everyone's leaving. No one wants to be here. It was super abundant, right? There was no work for us there, but it was important to our understanding, because we were understanding the system, right? And when we made that map, when we came back, and we did not do any secondary research, we literally took these 60 interviews and made these 2 maps of these places to understand what were the loops, what's happening. And what emerged for us in Sirsi was people were leaving because they felt there was a sense of stagnation there. They had a minimal availability of economic well-being, because they all had these totas of areca farms. There was multiple abundance of fruits and shrubs and spices, and plenty of rain. There's plenty of biomass. There's practically no crime, disease. Temperature is amazing. They complain about too much water sometime. Those are the privileges. And everyone was, it was, people have said that this is heaven on earth. I wouldn't want to move anyone anywhere from here, but everyone's leaving. All the young people are leaving. And in Bagepalli, all the young people are leaving because they can't survive there. There's no water to grow vegetables. There's no jobs, there's no firewood to cook food. There's no place to graze their cattle. So both the extremes taught us that people are leaving and they're looking for something else. Now, how do you solve for that when it comes to abundance, when it comes to revival, when it comes to connection with nature? And I think there are two things.
It's a great study. It's really interesting.
It was fascinating in that, it's exponentially expanded our lens. I'll put it more pragmatically, like I'm working and devoting my lives to revive our lost forests in a way that matters, not just for me. Because I'm having a good time just planting trees, but I was wanting to do something more than that. So we started to see that, what leads to degradation? Because there's degradation happening in the Western Ghats, but there's so much abundance, it's happening at a rate that we don't feel it. But when we speak to the scientists, they said it's going bad. Like this place is going to become Bagepalli in as short a time as 30 years, right? While you and I are alive, hopefully. So when we started looking at this, number one, I think it was about human choices, and it's about creating choices of abundance in any sort of ecosystem that we create. Even if it's the cities or if it's a village, I don't think there are set definitions for that. The definition resides in 2 things: create abundance. So if I have a need for water, if I have a need for energy, if I have a need to breathe clean air, how do I meet it in a way that's not extracting from nature and sort of destroying it? Can I co-evolve with nature and be abundant just like it? And similarly, if we imbibe this thinking first and then try and figure out frameworks and action models, how to do that for our cities? Can we be more abundant while creating cities and co-evolve with nature around it? And I think that, so your experience pushed me towards that, just to sort of share, because this is so exhilarating what I'm learning. And we're imbibing that in our work right now.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great.
Thanks, Shiva. This, I think the one thing that we're not speaking of at all is like economic activity and class, because this aspiration for abundance it's one thing to say it's to have all your needs met. And it's another thing to think of it in terms of the extractive promise of capitalism, right? So the choice seems to be tilted in the direction of living in a certain way. And I would love to hear in subsequent answers from all of you, it's not that hopeful, right? It's bleak as hell. And the reason why it's bleak as hell is that our economic choices are not oriented in the direction of creating a culture of abundance. Have yet economic models which facilitate that kind of behavior, right? You might have it in pockets, but there is an educational aspiration in terms of how you orient towards your needs. And then there's the other aspect of like how people who are not really connected to the city, such as us urbanites from upper class, upper caste backgrounds, sort of relate to it itself. So now I want to do another quick round of questions. This time, I'd like for you to say, it's 9:13 right now, and we won't go beyond another 15 minutes or so at most. I hope that's not a problem. If you do feel like chatting, though, we can always hang around, do this, and continue. So a quick, in 2 sentences or so, the question I want to ask you is really to ground the aspirations that you shared right now. Can you tell us about your latest news? What project are you working on today? How does it relate to some of the things that you've spoken of until now? Yeah, Abhay, starting with you. And this is particularly interesting. I was actually about to start with Qusai. We're going to come back to Qusai, who is also a real estate magnate. And not really, I'm overstating that fact, but he thinks a lot about land from another direction as well, not purely sensually, but also how do you create a sense of sensuality while having to meet the needs for housing within a city, right? So, Qusai, we'll come back to you, but Abhay, do you want to start off with your latest news in your environmental life?
Yes, for me, I think it would be climate transformation or transformative action in the context of climate change. And this is happening through 2 vehicles. One, of course, I was lucky enough to make some excellent friends along my journey, and we decided to start a non-profit, which is all of 1 month old, devoted to transforming the system and working through the language, the science, the vocabulary, and the networks that are in place when one is thinking and talking about climate change and climate action. The other, which is a bit of a secret project, but it's no longer secret, I suppose, since I'm talking about it, is a platform for climate justice that really takes learning as the solution to everything and anything, and really thinks of significant learning experiences for people across all age groups and across all categories that orient them to not just change their life, but change lives around them. So both projects are on climate change. One is a slightly more NGO, civil society, organization, projects, programs, funding kind of thing. The other one on climate justice, which really draws from my classroom, is the crazy space where I'll experiment in ways that I wouldn't normally. And together, I think that's what really keeps me excited and awake all the time.
Sorry. Do you want to say something about class and caste and privilege in your context as well? Because I'd love to hear all of your thoughts on this question, actually. So do you want to say something about how it plays into your imagination of your work at this time?
Yes, I mean, at one level, I think as a lawyer, I'm particularly a lawyer working on justice issues. I'm constantly being the uh, child who points out that the emperor has no clothes, and calling out privilege. That, of course, is a very regular feature of my work. At the same time, both class and caste and related elements of identity and power are things that I have to constantly remind myself of. I know that I am not in any way free from particular parochial ways of thinking and acting. I might pretend to be otherwise, but I am still wired to be a privileged, sometimes patriarchal, and certainly narcissistic and arrogant person. The sort of beauty of the moment is I no longer feel anger or guilt or shame or even frustration in coming to terms with this. It's a very, very comfortable recognition, and I think a little bit of patience with myself allows me to enjoy the process. Almost I'm patient with myself. At the same time, I see that I have places to go to, and if just the last point here, what's really sort of made all the difference for me, I think, on caste and classes is sort of this is again a privileged experience, but just being a homeless person in California for a few days and hanging out with a bunch of acid consuming deadheads in Golden Gate Park, and really sort of seeing how people lived in that park, and uh, experiencing that kind of homelessness, and then evaluating it against the poverty and the impoverishment that I see in India, has made me someone who's, I think, comfortable with uh, uh, recognizing when I have it wrong, or recognizing when I have a long journey in learning things, and constantly bringing it into every conversation. Sometimes it makes me unpopular, but to be honest, I don't mind that at all. At least a reaction is better than a shrug.
Oh yeah, for sure. This man, that was such a good response, because you just redirected it in the direction of your self awareness and growth on that path, without saying anything about like class or caste. That is a typical lawyerly response. I'm glad. I'm looking forward to hearing what Jyothy has to say about this, because she will be far less filtered, hopefully, while being as nuanced. Jyothy, do you want to say something about this? How you think about your latest, what is your latest muse, and how you think about class and caste and privilege in the context of environment?
So this also ties in with what you guys were talking about earlier, about communities and stuff. So one thing I've always noticed when it comes to communities, indigenous communities, with whom that's most of my work for the past 7 or 8 years. So I've always felt that they're never, I mean, including me, I'm also from a very privileged thing. So, everything that conversation surrounding them is in the pretext of saving them, solving stuff for them. In my experience with just the communities in the Nilgiris, what I have experienced is if anybody needs saving, it's us. They do lack certain things. They want education. They want basic facilities. So I feel like in those aspects we are tone deaf, right? In other things we make those decisions for them, you know and all of that I think is coming from that sense of privilege, and they are ST and we are some, I don't know what we are. And it's almost like how you we are like the policies and even NGOs, the way they deal with communities, it's almost like they have to parent these communities. They're not children. They have their own identities, they have their own aspirations. um, so in that, like I was honestly very disappointed with the work, activist work that was happening in my village. Very selfishly, I'm looking for solutions for my village. That's when I sort of came across the work that was happening in Ladakh, with the Sonam Wangchuk and like their ice super things and all that. And that's also become my next project, where what they have doing is in solving climate change issues, or mitigating those effects on local communities. they're working um, with the communities and developing technologies where they're integrating existing what do you call it, like existing Ladakhi technologies, so to speak. So they're kind of like developing that, and they're really listening to those people, and they're part of the solution. They're not somebody from outside coming and saying, okay, you have to relocate to this place or that place, and this is what you have to do or not. So the Ladakhis are making those choices for themselves, and these guys are developing, they are kind of incubating ideas and working on the ground to empower the young Ladakis in learning technologies, science, whatever, and not in the structured Indian educational system, in a more practical way. So they don't have to leave their communities, and they don't have to go to the cities, and and this also, I think, in turn kind of helps them nurture that connection with their roots, and they're proud of their work. And yeah, so so I think that is my biggest problem with privilege, in the context of the work that I do, where I feel, and it's the conversations I have with the people I work with also, because it's also most of my films are more or less like kind of like a collaboration with them. They say what they want to say, and I let them take the story wherever they want to take it. And they say this, like, that they're not heard. Why aren't they asked? Why is if they were so important to the world, if the forests were so important to the world, why are they not asked? So yeah.
That was a damn good answer. I think for me, the shift that you're making between designing for and designing with also speaks to what Sheeba was talking about earlier. This separation of the self and nature speaks to what Qusai and Abhay were talking about earlier. I really like how you framed that, Jyothy. So I suppose the question to ask ourselves is, nobody should not have to be able to move to the city if that's what they believe is the fountain of economic aspiration for them, And I can see that our conversation has been sounding now in retrospect almost a little patronizing about some of these things, because we end up slightly romanticizing it. I think, it's not really so much about being one or the other, but it's a fine edge, and we keep asking this question about privilege, and we should keep asking this question about privilege, because this belongs to all of us. It's not the law and justice is not the business of lawyers and justice actors, so to say, right? But it's all of ours, and it's a common prerogative. So it's worth exploring how that takes place. So thanks for that response, Sheeba, on both on privilege and your latest news. I'm really looking forward to your answer, because this morning we were talking about how you've moved now from designing planting systems to human systems. And I didn't want to continue that thread of conversation in the morning because I was looking forward to your answer. So I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
I'm going to keep it short.
Thanks.
It's 9:26. Yeah. I think I don't know. I mean, privilege has to be defined. I think it's quite individualistic. For me, privilege was, I felt I had a sense of power. I had a power to do stuff. I had an education. I had support from my family. I was sort of not caught in a construct where I could sort of do things, and I felt like my privilege should be channelized into something that appears meaningful to me. So I definitely came from a place of privilege. The other time when I felt a very clear-cut, strong sense of privilege was when I was building my home and living in the mountains. And, Jyothy, as a very classic case of working with the grassroots NGO, I was working on so many programs. I was part of the village. I was, I was a resident there. I'd built my home there. And I had a choice, I would go in and out of my work allowed me to be not having the same problems that others would have in the village, whether it's, not enough income or education for my child, things like that. So that was almost in my face privilege. I was privileged, and yet I could live wherever I wanted, whether it's in a godforsaken village in the Himalayas, and yet be fine with it. A lot of people, they were surrounded by abundance, surrounded by beauty, and then they wanted to leave because they didn't have enough primarily economic opportunities, they didn't have quality education, and also they didn't have quality healthcare, basic infrastructure. So that's how I think for me, privilege has played out to compel me to really channelize it into something bigger than me. So I see it as a force. Secondly, for my muse, I think I started in my work by creating forests. Yes, my starting point was if the forests are in place, the surrounding communities are going to fall into place in terms of meeting their needs, basic needs in a manner that they're not struggling, and economic opportunities will emerge from that. After 14 months of our project of working with 50 villages and reforesting their degraded common lands with native trees, I learned that I needed to pivot and I needed to really anchor our work in human lens and how they relate to their ecosystem, whether it's forest, water, and food and other stuff. So we've pivoted, and now we say that we take a more systemic approach to reviving forests, and which means that while we have to replant, the billions of trees that we've cut, we also have to address any community's needs, and we can define that, Badri. I mean, I think where you went with needs was how much we desire and capitalism. I think that's a definition that's open to any community you're working with. You define those needs, and you look at the basic needs of our food, water, energy, which are the sources of deforestation often. So let's design, so we've elevated ourselves to almost ecosystem design space. And we're going to convert an extractive ecosystem to a regenerative ecosystem. So it's kind of breaking it down. So if there is water needs for irrigation and people are digging more and more bore wells because the forests have been degraded, the surface water goes off, there's no groundwater recharge, and they're living on this bore well lottery, can we meet their needs? What is happening with that irrigation is basically they want to grow food and sell that food. So their real need is of food, not necessarily of irrigation. So can we bring in technologies and co-create them, Jyothy? I mean, I'm almost sort of insanely in love with co-creation. And we co-create technologies that are relevant for them. But yeah, and I'm pretty pro-tech in this way. And if we had to bring in hydroponics as a random example, right? Like what Sonam is doing with ice stupors. Or could we grow food without water, right? Could we grow food without water? And if that happens to an ecosystem, then you don't extract water. You let the rivers be, you let the underground water be. So while we reforest now, we map the basic needs of the community. We're doing this project in Bagepalli now, one of the places where we've done our research, and we are working with 15 villages there to design this pilot. And we say, okay, let's map our energy needs. So you're using trees for your cooking food, for energy, to boil water and other stuff. Let's look at other ways of you doing that. Like, how can you get energy? So we are actually looking at, there's a lot of bio waste there, like even human waste. Can we generate energy from there and not create energy from trees? Then we're looking at food. Their real need is food. Their real need is not irrigation. Their real need is to grow their crops. So how can we do that without extracting water from the ground? And then we are looking at their needs of water in a way that whatever is available in nature, how can you harvest that in the best way that you never extract from it? So simple tech with rainwater. We're looking at tech with energy, like pyrolysis, creating energy from bio-waste, human waste, converting that into biochar. That biochar goes into your farms, and also turning monoculture crops into more regenerative practices. So we're taking a really integrated approach. So it's sort of gone like this. And We feel that way the trees that we plant on their degraded commons will have a chance of being left to stand.
Right. Okay, that's I'm seeing both like attention and a synthesis of different kinds of approaches here, right? So if we abstract out what Jyothy was talking about as technology to just ways of doing things, as opposed to technical solutions for things, I suppose I can see the common ground between the two kind of approaches. Sheeba, you sound similar to like Qusai's modernist aspiration. He was speaking about it a little earlier, right? Which is borrow from anywhere and apply what is necessary to this time. And I think the point of similarity between Jyothi's response and yours is that the way to be indigenous to this time is to make available what is present to this time, right? The options which are present to this time, and a recognition of the past and the future that you want to sort of create through your actions, So I suppose indigeneity lies in how we are being present to our immediate surroundings, and living in a way that's continuous with it, as opposed to seeing the past and the future as being separate from you. I mean, we can speak like endlessly about time and how it's represented. It's 9:30.
In one line, Badri, I just say indigenization is about co-evolving with nature. So in these times, how do you co-evolve with nature? And you're present, and those choices should be available to us, to anyone.
For sure. And I think like to be a tribal means to make space for another person and or another being, and even plastic. I think a lot about empathy at a molecular level, not at an atomic level or this organic infinite kind of level, but an atomistic sort of approach ignores the connectedness of things, and the infinite kind of approach sees the sameness in things. And I like the idea of the molecule as being that aspiration for agency and coming together of atoms consciously to be molecules together, So in a certain way, I mean, it's a silly metaphor, but I've been tripping over this a little in the recent past. But thanks to that intervention, I do think like co-creation and co-evolution. I'm like, it's just that I don't like the sound of these words because it's so tender, I don't want them to lose their meaning. And when people say co-creation and co-evolving, I'm just thinking, man, this sounds like design research for HR teams, And
I mean, the way I would look at it, Badri, is create examples, intangible examples that say, hey, this is how co-creation works. I mean, people can take anything and turn that into anything. So either we fight that, or we say, you know what, I'm actually going to do this, show it, and then that's the way you change mindsets.
I think that's a great approach.
Yeah. We shouldn't be shy of using it. Yeah.
Because I agree with you. We need new models for showing what the full extent of co-evolution and co-creation is, right? Not like a bunch of people sticking sticky notes on a whiteboard.
And Sonam, like Jyothy said in Ladakh, is totally doing that. There's so many other, I'm part of many regenerative conversations these days in my work. People are really figuring this out. Now, people are also figuring it out. How do you make this extremely economically profitable for people who direct money in the world? So rather than fighting, say, hey, why are humans, greedy? We don't know when to stop, right? The point is, let's embrace that, because that's also human, right? So, so sort of moving away from morality is so individualistic, and you say, all right, I'm going to redefine morality, and I'm going to just make sort of making our extractive ways of living into regenerative ways of living. And you know what? I'm going to make it work for everyone, right? You need a certain kind of return from your investment. Let me figure it out how you get this return. So that they'd say money is going in a way that's healing us and healing the planet. Yeah. So just embracing the humanity. And I think what you said, I just sort of shifted to that human lens and say, you know what? Humans are capable of very bad things and capable of very good things. So we're going to just channelize this very good aspect of ours in a way to abate this very bad.
That's
humanity is meaning that we have.
Yeah, I mean, what is life without agency, right? Okay, it's 9:36 now, so we need to like at least pretend that we're about to close this conversation, which is I would much rather doesn't end at all. Qusai, before you answer, I'm going to just leave the next question so you can also answer that, and we can at least gracefully exit before it becomes indecent. So the last question that I want to ask all of you is, what is one thing that you've learned from your line of work? Let it be a fact, ideally, that you think everyone in the world should know. It can also be an orientation, but if you say like we should all be connected to each other, that like Miss Universe answers are not accepted. Okay? So it can be something like, you know what, these tree frogs secrete like radioactive blue pus. I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. I'm just trying to say that let it be an interesting fact that you've discovered, which you think would be nice for people to know. You know, it could have amused you, tickled you, whatever else it is. For Qusai, we need to ask that question every hour, not so much every year or every day. So anyway, Qusai, quickly.
Yeah. So and I do have to wrap up. So I have to leave after this question in like the next few minutes.
Yeah.
But what is that I really liked, enjoyed hearing everyone's responses, and I'm really like want to find out more about Abhay's crazy whatever experiences and all of your work. Basically, it's all fascinating, and I really want to know more and maybe get involved in any way I can or whatever. So for me, in terms of what I'm working with, Badri touched on this point about that I also have a real estate project, which is like a redevelopment project, very complex, 2 acres in the kind of densest area of central Bombay. And I'm working with that. And also I'm thinking of what to do, I'm feeling a call to move towards not a dense urban area, living more in nature. And I've learned a lot about thinking about intentional communities, experiments with utopia, and kind of how people can live together. My background is also in design, so looking at what are ways that humans can live together in a sustainable way, and in a way which is interesting. It feels like it's not going to the past. It feels like it's kind of engaging and enlivening, and people feel like they're really participating in culture and defining how the world should live. One of the things that I worry about or keep coming back to is with this idea of privilege, is that with 7 billion people on the planet, keep it coming back to that level, that 7 billion people, what can we do? And, do we just kind of let me see what can work for me? Do I have to think of how it can work for everyone? And that's something that I struggle with sometimes. And in terms of privilege, I think, Jyothy, what you also said is that sometimes the privilege, like working in and living in Bombay and working on kind of like a large project with, big numbers, lots of zeros, in that, and that the privilege is can sometimes be not a privilege. And one of the things I've learned is that people who are kind of rich and powerful in some ways, and which you have to interact with, who tend up making decisions, they are actually almost the most painted into a particular role and way of being, and they're so convinced that they're the top of the pyramid, and everyone would want to be like them, and stuff like that. Is that the kind of simpler pleasures, or I don't know how to say it without sounding too simplistic. They miss out a lot of life. In fact, they're living in the most automatic modes. They're living in they're the most kind of acting their lives out, and in a way, it might not be such a happy life, which is what I'm saying. But they think everything else is worse than that, and so it's both kind of like a privilege and a problem, and something like that. I don't think I'm articulating it very well, but that's what I have to say.
Dude, what I took from you is this aspect of impoverishment of the alphas who think they're organizing the world. Let's leave it at that, because otherwise it's a huge thing to sort of explore a little further. So we go around and then quickly close, hopefully in the next 2-3 minutes maximum. I'm so sorry guys for pushing this much. And also say bye now and then just shut it off abruptly. But we won't do that, please. So Jyothy, one thing that you've learned or discovered that you think it would be cool to share.
Okay, the one main thing that I realized was the power of collaboration. Really from the years, I felt like as a documentary filmmaker, you speak with a lot of stakeholders separately for interviews and stuff. And I realized I used to think if only these people spoke with each other, had these kind of forums and where they were exchanging ideas and everything. I thought there was a lot of disconnect in that sense. And I think, but I think that is happening now. that, policy makers, forest officials, representatives from the community, scientists, filmmakers, all are like coming together at various stages. But I think that is really missing. Like, that knowledge sharing is not there. We are all so I don't know about your communities, but at least in my field, there is so much of ego and we don't share notes. And it's the same thing with biologists and scientists and even NGOs. So, yeah, for me, that is I feel if people come together, much in the way that you guys are doing with mutual aid and stuff, but for larger problems, I think we can find solutions, and it is possible. And yeah, it if only we listen to each other.
Okay. It's okay. Thank you, Jyoti. Okay, one or two sentences, Abhay, Shiva, and then Q.
I think for me, it's in one line. Through my work, I increasingly believe in the power of the collective wisdom, and I live by it. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Abhay.
Sorry to end on this morbid note. I've discovered that if you're always thinking of death, things actually are very beautiful and nothing can go wrong. So I've discovered it in and through many personal experiences, but also discovered it's part of spiritual, ethical, and philosophical wisdom. So keeping death as a bosom friend, as Gandhi said, really works, and it has worked for me.
Wow, thanks. I've been thinking a lot about death too, Abhay. Let me find another excuse to have this conversation at a later point in time. I'm going to come back to this. Qusai, last thoughts?
I think I've talked about this idea, so I don't have any. I mean, I think that's a good way to end. I love that answer. I think that because becoming friends with death eventually, gives rise to a fearlessness, right? Because what's the worst that can happen? You can die. So let's try some stuff and see what we can do, and not keep the status quo. You can just do new things and explore new directions.
Yeah, the idea is that death makes life possible, right? Like that's where activism also began in Jyothi's the second answer onwards. Anyway, so guys, thank you all so much for participating. Once again, this is meant to be a fundraiser. Please contribute whatever you can. The idea is that we have a version of the media that's not beholden to private interests, and we don't have to rely on perspectives which are necessarily colored by interest we don't understand, right? That's really the problem in terms of transmissions that we have. And the bigger problem is that we don't have enough beauty. We don't have like random acts of generosity. We don't have enough thoughtfulness. We don't have enough focus on knowledge, which is not going to change for hundreds of years, right? And has been relevant for the last 1,000 years or whenever humanity came up. So we need to have more of these more often. And we feel like there's a good medium to do it. And we think like raising money for specific efforts is the right direction to go, because the cost of broadcasting is now nearly nothing, right? And yeah, so it's wonderful. Once again, to close this, thank you so much for sharing this with me, with all of us. We have Padmini, Kritika, Vipul, Aishwarya, Anuradha, who've all been working with us on this effort. And it's really beautiful that it's come together as today's session. Thank you so much for your time. And I hope to catch you again in another life.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank
Look
you.
forward to
Bye.
meeting you in